"Hand over the wounded Navy SEAL," Victor Romano said, his voice carrying across the emergency department as 6 men in dark jackets spread through the trauma bay entrance. Nurses froze. A security officer instinctively reached for his radio before realizing he was hopelessly outnumbered. The patient on trauma bed 3 had lost too much blood to survive another transfer. Claire Donovan didn't look at the armed strangers. She tightened the pressure dressing over the man's shoulder, checked the monitor, and answered without raising her voice. "No." The single word changed the room. Romano stared at her as though she had spoken a language nobody else dared use. "You don't understand," he said. "That man leaves with us." Claire reached for another unit of O-negative blood instead of stepping away. "He's my patient," she replied. "He stays." One of the younger physicians hurried toward her, panic written across his face. "Claire, don't do this. We can let law enforcement handle it." She didn't argue. She simply continued assessing the patient's airway, feeling for a stronger pulse while speaking to another nurse. "Increase the fluids. Keep his pressure above 90. Prep another portable ultrasound." The confidence in her instructions slowed the chaos around her. Even the charge nurse, who technically outranked her, followed without hesitation. Romano watched with growing irritation. Most people negotiated. Most people begged. This woman behaved as though the men blocking every exit barely existed. A loud crash echoed from the waiting area as frightened visitors were escorted towards safer rooms. Claire's eyes flicked toward the sound for less than a second before returning to the patient. Her attention never drifted long enough to miss the irregular rhythm appearing on the cardiac monitor. "He's compensating," she said. "Not for long." She adjusted the oxygen mask before the attending physician noticed the subtle change in breathing. Seconds later, the monitor alarm confirmed exactly what she had anticipated. The physician looked at her with open surprise. "How did you catch that?" Claire didn't answer. She was already preparing the next intervention. Romano stepped closer until only a few feet separated them. "Last warning, nurse." Without taking her eyes off the patient, Claire shifted half a step, placing herself between the stretcher and the approaching men. The movement was economical, almost automatic, as though she had practiced protecting wounded people in crowded rooms countless times before. An older hospital security officer frowned. Something about that footwork tugged at a memory he couldn't place. It wasn't hospital training. It looked disciplined, deliberate, familiar. Claire reached beneath the blanket to secure the patient's foretubing before it could snag if the bed had to move quickly. As she leaned forward, a thin silver chain slipped briefly from beneath her scrub top. A worn military-style dog tag flashed under the trauma lights before disappearing again. She tucked it back inside without noticing who had seen it. The security officer's expression changed. He didn't recognize the name engraved on the tag, but he recognized its age and the way she instinctively concealed it. Romano noticed none of it. His attention remained fixed on the nurse refusing to surrender. "You think this hospital can protect you?" he asked. Claire finally met his eyes. "No," she answered. "I'm protecting him." Before anyone could react, the wounded SEAL's oxygen saturation plunged. The room erupted into urgent movement. Claire immediately redirected the team, calling for specific equipment with crisp precision that left no room for confusion. Every instruction arrived exactly when it was needed, buying precious seconds that the rest of the team hadn't realized they were losing. Even the attending physician found himself following her lead instead of giving orders. Then, just as the patient's condition began to stabilize, every monitor in the trauma bay suddenly switched to emergency lockdown mode, and a flashing security alert appeared across the hospital network. Someone had sealed every exit from inside the building. The flashing lockdown alert spread across every monitor before anyone in the trauma bay understood what it meant. Automatic fire doors began sliding into place throughout the hospital, isolating entire wings within seconds. Visitors gasped. Staff members reached for their badges, only to discover that normal access had been suspended. Victor Romano smiled for the first time since entering the emergency department. "Now nobody is coming," he said. Claire Donovan barely acknowledged him. She glanced once toward the ceiling, listening instead of staring at the screens. The ventilation fans continued running. Backup power had not engaged. The lockdown was selective, not a total systems failure. "The operating rooms still have network access," she said to the charge nurse. Move the blood bank request through surgery instead of emergency. The nurse hesitated. That is not protocol. Claire looked at the patient whose blood pressure had begun drifting downward again. If we wait for protocol, we lose time. The attending physician frowned. The system is locked. Nothing is getting through. Even so, the charge nurse followed Claire's suggestion. Less than a minute later, the request appeared on the surgical network exactly as Claire predicted, and refrigerated blood units were already being dispatched from another floor. The physician stared at the confirmation screen before looking back at Claire. How did you know that? She only answered, hospitals are built with redundancies for a reason. The explanation sounded ordinary, yet something about the speed of her conclusion unsettled everyone nearby. Romano noticed the growing confidence among the staff and stepped closer. You keep making decisions like you are running this room. Claire secured another intravenous line while checking the patient's pupils with a penlight. One reacted slightly slower than the other. She immediately requested another portable ultrasound. The resident shook his head. The shoulder wound explains the blood loss. We already know where he is injured. Claire did not argue. Instead, she pointed toward the monitor. His heart rate is improving, but his pressure is not recovering at the same pace. Something else is stealing volume. The resident looked unconvinced, yet the attending physician allowed the scan. Moments later, the ultrasound revealed free fluid that had not been suspected. During the first assessment, the physician inhaled sharply. There is abdominal bleeding too. Claire did not celebrate being right. She simply updated the treatment plan while another nurse prepared the operating room. Around them, the tension continued building. Romano's men exchanged impatient glances. Their original demand had turned into a waiting game they had never expected. Across the room, the older security officer kept watching Claire. Every movement seemed measured before it happened. She always positioned carts to preserve clear escape paths. She instinctively stood where she could see every doorway without appearing to watch them. None of those habits belonged in ordinary hospital orientation. While helping adjust the patient's blanket, Claire's scrub sleeve slid back just enough to reveal a faint tan line circling her wrist. It looked as though something had been worn there for years before recently being removed. The security officer noticed it. So did one of Romano's men, who narrowed his eyes without understanding why such a small detail felt familiar. Claire pulled the sleeve back down and continued working. A loud tone interrupted the room again. This time it came from the patient's cardiac monitor. His rhythm remained stable, but a secure military identification chip hidden inside his emergency medical bracelet had finally synchronized with the restored network. A coded notification appeared on a nearby workstation before instantly disappearing behind encrypted security warnings. No names, no explanations, just a string of restricted access messages that caused the hospital information technician monitoring the network upstairs to freeze and immediately pick up the emergency phone. The information technician stared at the encrypted notification, then tried opening it with his hospital credentials. Access denied. He escalated to administrator clearance. Access denied again. Before he could attempt another override, the message erased itself, leaving only a timestamp and a security classification he had never seen on a civilian medical network. Downstairs, the trauma team remained unaware of what had just happened. Their attention shifted to the operating room doors as the attending surgeon announced they had a narrow window to move the patient. We take him now, he said. Victor Romano stepped directly into the path. Nobody moves that stretcher. For the first time, the room reached a standstill. Every second they waited increased the patient's risk. The attending physician hesitated, caught between medical necessity and the threat standing a few feet away. Claire Donovan studied the patient's monitor instead of Romano. His blood pressure had stabilized enough to survive transport, but only if they moved immediately. Waiting even another 5 minutes could erase the progress they had fought to achieve. She turned toward the charge nurse. Use hallway C instead of the main surgical corridor. The nurse looked confused. That hallway has been closed for remodeling. Claire shook her head. Only the north entrance. The south side still connects through central sterile. The construction barriers never blocked the emergency transport route. The charge nurse frowned. I do not remember that. Facilities rerouted it last month after the sprinkler inspection. There was no confidence in Claire's voice, only certainty built on observation. The nurse quickly confirmed it over the internal radio. Seconds later, Maintenance answered that the passage was indeed open. The attending surgeon immediately changed the transport route. Romano glanced toward one of his men, who rushed out to intercept the new path, only to discover he was already too late. Hospital staff were repositioning equipment through the alternate corridor. It was not a dramatic victory, but it bought the trauma team exactly what they needed: momentum. The stretcher rolled forward several feet before Romano ordered everyone to stop again. Even so, something had changed. The physicians who had questioned Claire minutes earlier were no longer dismissing her. Resident looked puzzled. "That will delay us. Only for 10 seconds. The team followed her instruction. The brief adjustment reduced the pressure on the injured area just long enough for the bleeding to slow again, allowing another secure dressing to be applied before transport resumed. The surgeon looked at her with growing respect. "You have seen injuries like this before." Claire secured the blanket around the patient without answering the question. As she stepped away, one of the transport nurses accidentally dropped a stainless steel instrument tray. The sharp metallic crash echoed across the emergency department. Almost everyone flinched. Claire did not. Her eyes moved instantly toward the nearest doorway, then toward the ceiling cameras, before returning to the patient in less than a heartbeat. The older security officer caught the reaction. It was too fast, too disciplined to be coincidence. He had seen veterans respond that way after unexpected sounds, but he kept the thought to himself. Before anyone could process that moment, the hospital technician called the emergency department. His voice was unusually tense. "Do not disconnect that patient's bracelet under any circumstances. I cannot explain why, but someone outside this hospital is already trying to access his medical status through a restricted government channel." The attending physician stared at the phone in disbelief. Romano's expression hardened. Claire said nothing, but for the first time she looked directly at the bracelet wrapped around the wounded SEAL's wrist. A tiny indicator light that had remained dark since his arrival had just turned solid green. Claire Donovan watched the tiny green light on the military medical bracelet for only a moment before returning her attention to the patient. She did not touch it. She did not ask why it had activated. Instead, she checked his airway once more and confirmed the fresh blood unit had reached the correct flow rate. The attending surgeon noticed the bracelet as well, but chose not to interrupt the treatment. The technician's warning echoed in everyone's mind. Someone outside the hospital was trying to reach this wounded man through a network that ordinary hospitals were never supposed to see. Victor Romano followed Claire's gaze and finally realized the bracelet mattered. "Take it off," he ordered one of his men. "Whatever it is, I want it." Nobody moved. Even Romano's own people hesitated after hearing the technician's warning over the speakerphone. Claire spoke before anyone else could react. Removing medical equipment from an unstable trauma patient could interrupt monitoring. She was not arguing about ownership. She was protecting the patient's condition. The surgeon immediately supported her. "She is right. It stays where it is until surgery." Romano's expression darkened. Every delay was slipping the situation farther from his control. The transport team resumed preparing the stretcher while Claire checked every line one final time. As she adjusted the patient's blanket, she instinctively folded the loose tubing into compact loops instead of leaving it hanging over the rail. The movement took less than 3 seconds, yet every connection became organized and impossible to snag during transport. One of the veteran operating room nurses stopped and stared. "Who taught you to package lines like that?" she asked. Claire answered without looking up. "Someone who hated wasting seconds." It was the only explanation she offered. The operating room nurse frowned. She had seen that exact method years earlier during a military disaster response exercise, but she could not remember where. The thought lingered without becoming an answer. As the stretcher finally began moving through the alternate hallway, the emergency department settled into a strange rhythm. Doctors were no longer questioning every recommendation Claire made. They still viewed her as an emergency room nurse, yet they had begun adjusting their own pace to match hers. That subtle shift did not escape Romano. If the medical staff continued trusting her, removing the patient would become even more difficult. He stepped aside and reached for his phone instead of blocking the hallway again. He spoke only a few quiet words before ending the call. Claire noticed the change immediately. He had stopped trying to force the situation himself. That usually meant he expected someone else to arrive. The realization tightened the urgency inside the surgical team. The hallway remained clear for another few yards before every elevator on the floor chimed at exactly the same moment. The digital indicators above each door changed simultaneously, all descending toward the emergency level without anyone inside the hospital requesting them. Nurses exchanged nervous glances. The security officer instinctively moved closer to the stretcher. Even Romano lifted his eyes toward the bank of elevators, waiting. Claire did not say a word, but she subtly repositioned herself beside the patient's shoulder, leaving a clear path for the surgical team while keeping the stretcher moving forward. Nobody yet knew who was inside those elevators, only that whatever had awakened the bracelet had now reached the hospital. The elevator doors had not opened yet when the wounded SEAL's breathing suddenly became more labored. The portable monitor showed his blood pressure slipping again despite everything the trauma team had done. The surgeon looked toward the operating room another 50 feet away, then back at the patient. If we keep moving, we risk losing him before surgery. If we stop, we lose precious minutes. Every option carried danger. Claire Donovan examined the drainage, the monitor, and the position of the stretcher in a single sweep before making a decision. Stop for 30 seconds, she said. Raise the head 10 degrees. We need to stabilize him before the next transfer. The surgeon hesitated. That costs time. Transport stress is costing more. There was no guarantee she was right, only a judgment based on what she was seeing in front of her. After one tense moment, the surgeon nodded. The team followed her instructions. Claire repositioned the oxygen tubing, adjusted the intravenous flow within the physician's orders, and asked one nurse to support the patient's shoulder while another secured the abdominal dressing that had begun to loosen during transport. The monitor numbers stopped drifting downward. They did not improve dramatically, but they became steady enough to continue. The surgeon released a slow breath. Move now. As the stretcher rolled again, several staff members exchanged surprised glances. A few minutes earlier, they had questioned nearly every recommendation Claire made. Now they found themselves waiting for her assessment before taking the next step. Even the resident who had challenged her ultrasound request lowered his voice. Good call, he admitted. Claire simply answered, he still needs surgery. She accepted neither praise nor attention because the crisis had not ended. The elevator doors finally slid open. Two men in dark business suits stepped out first, followed by a woman carrying a secured government identification wallet. None of them displayed weapons or military uniforms. Their presence alone changed the atmosphere. The hospital security officer approached cautiously. Before he could speak, the woman held up her credentials just long enough for him to recognize that they represented a federal agency with authority beyond the hospital. We are here for the patient wearing the encrypted medical bracelet, she said. Is he alive? The surgeon answered first. Barely. We are taking him to surgery. The woman nodded without interfering. Her eyes moved across the hallway until they stopped on Claire. She studied the emergency room nurse for several silent seconds, as though trying to place a face she had seen somewhere before. She did not greet her. She did not explain anything. Instead, she turned to one of her colleagues and asked in a voice low enough that only those nearest could hear, was there supposed to be another medical specialist assigned to this transport? The man checked a secure tablet. He frowned. Negative. Only civilian emergency staff. The woman looked back at Claire once more, still saying nothing. The moment passed, but the question lingered in everyone's mind. Why had a federal officer expected someone else? Before anyone could ask, the wounded SEAL stirred for the first time since arriving at the hospital. His eyes opened only slightly, unfocused and strained, yet they stopped the instant they found Claire beside the stretcher. His lips moved. The words were barely audible. They were not asking for help. They were not calling for a doctor. He whispered a single unfamiliar call sign, one that made the woman with the federal credentials slowly lower her tablet, as if she had just recognized something she never expected to hear inside a civilian hospital. The unfamiliar call sign lingered in the hallway long after the wounded SEAL's voice faded. Claire Donovan showed no visible reaction beyond checking his pulse once more before signaling the team to continue toward the operating room. The federal officer, however, did react. She did not repeat the call sign or explain its meaning. Instead, she quietly requested a secure communication line from her colleague while keeping her eyes on Claire. Whatever she had just heard clearly matched something in a classified system, yet she offered no answers. The surgeons resumed moving the stretcher, and the hallway filled again with purposeful motion. As they reached the operating room entrance, the attending surgeon paused. "We have one chance to stabilize him before we begin. I need everyone focused." Claire immediately reviewed the medications, confirmed blood availability, and verified that every line remained secure after the difficult transport. The surgeon noticed she had already completed several safety checks before anyone assigned them. "You have done this under pressure before," he observed. Claire met his eyes for only a moment. Enough to know that skipping the basics is what people regret later. Her answer explained nothing about her past, but it explained everything about her priorities. Inside the operating suite, the veteran operating room nurse quietly spoke to the charge nurse while preparing sterile instruments. "I remembered where I saw that tubing method," she whispered. "It was during a Department of Defense disaster medicine course almost 10 years ago. Civilian nurses were invited to observe, but only military trauma instructors actually demonstrated it." The charge nurse looked through the operating room window toward Claire. "Are you saying she was military?" The veteran nurse shook her head. "I am saying somebody trained her who believed every second mattered." The distinction only deepened the mystery. Meanwhile, the federal officer finally received a response through her encrypted headset. She listened without interrupting, then asked only one question. "Is there any confirmed record connecting Claire Donovan to the active protection detail?" Several seconds passed before the answer came back. Her expression remained controlled, but she slowly lowered the headset. "No confirmed record," she repeated. "Only an archived reference marked incomplete." She requested no further explanation. An incomplete record was not proof, only another fragment that refused to fit neatly into the growing puzzle. Outside the operating room, the older security officer approached Claire while the surgical team completed its final preparations. "Earlier tonight you noticed every doorway before anyone else," he said. "Then you organized the evacuation routes before security even responded. Most emergency room nurses do not think that way." Claire adjusted her gloves before answering. "Hospitals have more than one emergency at a time. You learn to protect the people who cannot protect themselves." The officer nodded slowly. He realized she had answered his question without actually answering it. Still, the respect in his expression had replaced the doubt from earlier that night. The surgeon stepped to the operating room doors and looked directly at Claire. "I want you staying on this case through surgery. You have earned that place." She accepted the responsibility without celebration because the patient still needed every available hand. As the doors began closing, one of the federal officer's secure devices vibrated again. This time it displayed a newly decrypted archival image. The photograph showed a group of military medical personnel standing beside a field evacuation helicopter years earlier. Most of the faces had been automatically blurred by age and classification, but one remained partially visible. The officer stared at the image, then slowly looked up toward Claire through the operating room glass. The posture, the eyes, and the silver chain beneath the collar matched too closely to dismiss as coincidence. The operating room doors had barely closed when the federal officer stepped to the observation window, holding the restored archival photograph beside the glass. The faded image showed a field evacuation team standing beside a military helicopter after a successful casualty extraction years earlier. Most faces remained obscured by security redactions, but one figure wore the same unmistakable silver chain, now resting beneath Claire Donovan's scrub collar. The woman in the photograph stood exactly as Claire stood now, shoulders squared, eyes fixed on the patient instead of the cameras. The federal officer handed the photograph to the hospital security supervisor without a word. He compared the image to the nurse working inside the operating room and slowly lowered the page. Nobody needed an explanation anymore. The fragments from the entire night had quietly assembled themselves. The dog tag, the battlefield habits, the trauma techniques, the reaction to sudden sounds, the unfamiliar call sign whispered by the wounded SEAL. They were no longer isolated mysteries. They belonged to the same person standing only a few feet away. Inside the operating room, the attending surgeon encountered another complication as the patient's blood pressure fluctuated again during preparation. Several treatment options remained available, each carrying different risks. Claire studied the monitor, the blood loss estimate, and the medication timeline before speaking. "If we rush the next step before his pressure recovers, we will spend the rest of the case trying to catch up." The surgeon paused. It was not a dramatic suggestion. It was disciplined judgment. After a brief consideration, he adjusted the sequence of the procedure accordingly. Within minutes, the patient's vital signs stabilized enough to safely continue. The operating room relaxed just enough for everyone to breathe again. No applause followed. No celebration interrupted the work. The success belonged to the entire team, yet every member understood that Claire's decision had helped create the opportunity. Outside, the federal officer finally received formal authorization to open the archived reference attached to Claire Donovan's incomplete record. Only a handful of lines became visible. Former Special Forces combat medic. Medical evacuation operations. Honorably separated. Remaining operational details restricted. Nothing else appeared. No mission summaries. No classified history. No heroic speeches. Only enough information to confirm what the night's events had already proven through her actions. The federal officer quietly closed the file. "That is all we are cleared to know," she said. The older security officer looked through the glass once more. Turns out she never needed the file to earn anyone's respect. The operating room nurse who had recognized Claire's training method nodded in agreement. "We watched her earn it before we ever learned where she came from." Their voices carried no excitement. Only admiration built from witnessing responsibility under relentless pressure. Several minutes later, the lead surgeon stepped back from the table and looked directly at Claire. "We have him," he said. "He is going to make it." Relief spread through the room, but Claire did not smile with triumph. She immediately began helping the circulating nurse organize instruments, verify documentation, and prepare the patient for transfer to intensive care. Her focus never shifted toward herself. The surgeon watched quietly before speaking one last time. "Thank you." Claire simply nodded. "He still has a long recovery ahead." That answer affected the room more deeply than any military record could have. She had spent the entire night protecting a stranger because that was the responsibility in front of her, not because anyone would eventually discover who she had once been. As the patient was wheeled toward intensive care, his eyes opened for a brief moment. He looked at Claire with clearer focus than before and managed a faint, grateful smile. Then his gaze shifted toward the silver dog tag beneath her collar, as though recognizing something only the two of them understood, before he whispered, "The commander. He will want to see you." The intensive care unit doors closed behind the recovering SEAL, and for the first time that night the hallway grew quiet. No one hurried to fill the silence. The attending surgeon removed his gloves and looked toward Claire Donovan with the same respect he normally reserved for colleagues who had spent decades in trauma medicine. He did not ask another question about her past because he no longer needed one. Everything he needed to know had been written in the decisions she made when every second mattered. The resident who had challenged her judgment earlier stepped beside her carrying an empty blood warmer. "I should have listened sooner," he admitted. Claire accepted the equipment from his hands before answering. "You listen when it counted. That is what matters." The words stayed with him longer than any lecture ever could. Down the hallway, the veteran operating room nurse carefully folded the unused supplies back into their proper places. This time she copied the same organized method Claire had used throughout the night. The younger nurses quietly followed without being asked, adopting small habits they had witnessed only hours before. No one announced that anything had changed, yet the entire team had begun working differently because of one person who never tried to stand out. The older security officer walked past the observation window, where Victor Romano and his associates were now being escorted away under federal supervision. He remembered the first moment Claire had answered a single word without stepping away from her patient. No. At the time it had sounded impossible. Now it sounded inevitable. She had never been trying to challenge anyone. She had simply refused to abandon someone who depended on her. The federal officer approached Claire one final time before leaving the hospital. She returned the restored archival photograph without offering ceremony. "This belongs in your file," she said. Claire glanced at the faded image only briefly before shaking her head. "Keep it with the record. The people in that photograph deserve to be remembered together." She was looking not at herself, but at the faces standing beside her years before. The officer understood immediately. The photograph represented a team, not an individual. She nodded and carefully placed it back inside the secured folder. Before walking away, she offered the smallest gesture of respect, not through words, but with a simple inclination of her head. Claire answered with the same quiet courtesy before turning back toward the nurse's station. There were new admissions waiting. A frightened little boy with a broken arm had just arrived with his parents after a bicycle accident. Claire knelt beside him, smiled, and explained every step before anyone touched the cast supplies. Within moments, the child's fear had eased. The charge nurse watched from across the room and smiled to herself. Whether the patient wore a military bracelet or a baseball jersey, Claire treated every life with the same steady commitment. As dawn light filtered through the hospital windows, the attending surgeon found Claire quietly replacing supplies in Trauma Bay 3. The room looked almost exactly as it had before the night began, except for one empty stretcher and the memory of everything that had happened around it. "You saved his life," the surgeon said. Claire placed a fresh pressure dressing into the cabinet and answered with the same simple conviction that had begun the entire night. "He was my patient." The surgeon nodded without another word. Hours earlier, those same words had sounded like defiance. Now everyone understood they had always been a promise. Morning settled over St. Alder's Hospital with the quiet rhythm that always followed a long night. The emergency department looked ordinary again. Fresh coffee replaced the smell of antiseptic from the trauma bay. New patients arrived with everyday emergencies, unaware that only hours earlier an entire hospital had stood between fear and responsibility. Claire Donovan signed the last page of her shift report with the same careful handwriting she used every morning. She never added a note about the choices she had made or the lives she had helped protect. The report simply documented vital signs, medications, and transfer times because that was what mattered to the next team walking through the door. Around her, however, small changes had already taken root. The resident who once questioned every recommendation now paused before entering each trauma room, taking a full second to observe. Before speaking, the charge nurse reorganized emergency carts using the same efficient layout Claire had demonstrated during the crisis. Even the veteran security officer quietly adjusted patrol routes to give medical teams faster access through crowded hallways, remembering how quickly a few saved seconds could change an outcome. Nobody announced these changes. They simply became part of the hospital, woven naturally into routines that would help strangers for years to come. Before leaving, the attending surgeon stopped outside intensive care. Through the window, he saw the wounded Navy SEAL resting peacefully, surrounded not by headlines or ceremony, but by the steady beeping of monitors and the ordinary work of recovery. He thought back to the first impossible demand that had echoed through the emergency department. "Hand over the wounded Navy SEAL." At the time, one nurse had answered with a single word. "No." Looking at the recovering patient now, he understood that the word had never been an act of defiance. It had been the beginning of every life that continued because someone chose responsibility over fear. As Claire collected her jacket from her locker, she slipped the familiar silver dog tag beneath her collar once again. It disappeared from view exactly as it always had. The federal officer's secured file remained closed. The photograph stayed with the official record, exactly where Claire had asked for it to remain. Some stories belonged to history. Others belonged only to the people who had lived them. Claire stepped outside just as the first sunlight reflected across the hospital entrance. An ambulance pulled in with another patient needing help. Without hesitation, she turned back toward the automatic doors and held them open until the stretcher rolled safely inside. None of the new arrivals recognized her face. None of them knew what had happened during the night. To them, she was simply another nurse making sure someone reached treatment a little faster. The attending surgeon watched from the lobby as the doors closed behind her one last time. He smiled almost to himself, then returned to work with a different understanding of what quiet courage looked like. Inside the emergency department, Trauma Bay 3 stood fully stocked again, ready for whoever might need it next. The room no longer carried the tension of the previous night, yet one promise still seemed to linger within its walls. Every patient who entered deserved someone willing to stand between them and whatever threatened their chance to live. Claire never tried to become that symbol. She simply chose it, one patient at a time. And long after the hospital returned to normal, the people whose lives crossed hers found themselves making the same choice whenever their own moment finally arrived.